Let's open our Bibles to Mark, the Gospel by Mark, chapter 4. We're entering a new part of the Gospel by Mark after finishing the third chapter and going into the fourth. And as we go to the fourth chapter, Jesus changes gears. Jesus is, if you're tracking and looking at a harmony of the Gospel, what's happened is in the 12th chapter was what we call the national rejection of Christ. The delegation from Jerusalem came, the religious leaders, and they gave their opinion, more than their opinion, their verdict on who he was. And they said that he was from Satan, and that he was doing what he did in the power of Satan. And because of that national rejection, the religious leaders from the temple, from the repository of the worship of the eternal God, when they came and delivered their verdict in chapter 12 of Matthew, which is happening in chapter 3 of Mark, at that moment, Jesus changes. He no longer preaches long sermons in public like he used to. He reverts to what we're going to see in chapter 4. That's called his parabolic or teaching in parables ministry. And from here on, Jesus never publicly gives any of these elongated teaching times like the Sermon on the Mount stuff. He only gives these short stories from life that have a little twist to them. And that's an amazing change in the whole flow of the Gospels. And I'm going to show you, but this begins, this day that we're looking at actually begins in chapter 3, verse 20. So go back from chapter 4 a little bit. Let me talk to you about the day. It's been a long day for Jesus. Jesus started the day teaching inside a house somewhere up in Galilee in chapter 3, verse 20. And in that time, as the multitude is milling around, Jesus was approached, as you remember, we covered this a month or so back, by his own family that tried to arrest him. It says in verse 21, they wanted to lay hold of him. It's the same lay hold of that's all the way through the book of Acts when they lay hold of Paul and put him in jail, and lay hold of the apostles and put them in jail and beat them. It was literally the word arrest. We're looking at one day in the life of Christ. The day started in chapter 3, verses 20 and 21, at a low point. Jesus' own family thought he'd gone crazy. His brothers and Mary. They wanted to drag him home because he was out of his mind because he was doing all this elongated teaching. They wanted to drag him back to Nazareth so they could take care of him. And so that's how it started. Then look in verse 22. He was attacked by the religious leaders. This is the official verdict when they say that he was an agent of the devil. And remember when we covered that? The sin for which there's no forgiveness? Jesus told them that they were close to the sin for which they could never be forgiven. Then looking around, starting in verse 31, Jesus explained who was really in his family. Remember that day? He looked all the way around at those sitting at his feet, and he said, you want to know who's really in my family? You that are doing the will of my Father in heaven. Now, he heads in chapter 4, and it's still the same day. He heads to the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and he begins teaching in parables, and if you look all the way down through chapter 4, verse 34, he concludes this parabolic section. Mark only records a few of them. Matthew records more of them in chapter 13. Remember, the gospel writers were selective in what they put in. They had to follow the purpose and intent God had ordained for their gospel. And the gospel of Mark shows Jesus as a servant, and so he only does scattered parables. But look at verse 35. It says of chapter 4, on the same day. Now, for those of you that are followers of the harmony of the life of Christ, this is the longest day in the life of Christ, the longest recorded day of ministry. The second longest is his last public ministry just before he's crucified. But this day is massive when you put together everything that Luke says, everything that Matthew says, and you interleave it. Jesus was going from sun up, and look here, the same day when evening had come, in verse 35, he said, let's cross over the other side. He isn't done. There's big stuff still coming. Evening, by the way, for the Jewish people, evening started after 3 o'clock. The evening sacrifice at the temple was sacrificed at 3 in the afternoon. That's exactly the moment when Jesus was giving up the ghost, giving up the spirit, and said it is finished. But evening for them is after 3. So it's after 3 o'clock. He said, let's cross over. And by the way, verse 38 says that the day had been so full that, look what happens, he falls asleep. The storm takes up. By the way, it was most likely the prince of the power of the air trying to drown him. Remember, Satan was always trying to either have Herod kill him or have the people stone him, or throw him off the cliff or, whatever. So the devil was always trying to do Christ in. And so he stands up and rebukes the sea. And look at chapter 5, verse 1. Same day. And this is chapter 3:20 all the way through chapter 5:20 is one single day in the life of Christ. A 2-chapter long day. Unbelievable. And you all know the story, the demons in the demoniac of Gadara. And that's the day. Back to chapter 4. And I just want to focus on the middle of the day. Okay, halftime here. Jesus heads to the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Perhaps the largest crowd that ever had assembled so far in his ministry is assembled. The wording of the text appears to be describing the largest group yet. So this huge crowd assembles on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus has prepared by having a boat pushed out, and he's in the boat, sitting down and teaching. And to this day, when you come out of the city of Capernaum and follow the shore of the Sea of Galilee around, right after Capernaum, you come to the Cove of the Sower, it's called. The Cove of the Sower and the Seeds parable. That's what we're looking at. It's still there today. They still call it the Cove of the Sower. And when you come around that corner, it almost looks like a natural amphitheater. If you've ever been in Los Angeles, the Hollywood Bowl looks very similar. It's kind of in the hillside, and it's just like this. And it's a place where, to this day, you could fit 10,000 people right there in the Cove of the Sower by Capernaum. And if you stand on the shore, in fact, this has been done, many groups have done it, and as soon as they open it up again, we'll do it again. You can stand on the shore, and people can be as far up as the top of the hill, and if you just talk in a normal tone of voice like this, they can hear you at the top of the hill. Because of the water being behind you, and because of the enclosure, the way that the hill slopes down in a amphitheater shape. And so Jesus is in that amphitheater-like shape, maybe 7,000 to 10,000 people clearly hearing him speak from one of the most ideal natural spots on earth. And here it is in Mark that Jesus starts his famous parables. Jesus, as I said, begins going into the parable mode. Parables are fascinating, and by the way, Jesus didn't originate them, but he mastered the art of the parable. Jesus was such a master storyteller and such a supreme parabler that even the people that didn't believe in him got the message. In fact, Matthew records in chapter 12 that when Jesus got done with the parables, the religious leaders got so angry they wanted to kill him on the spot because they knew he was talking about them. Jesus was such a tremendous storyteller. The Gospels record more than 35 parables. Jesus probably spoke many others, but these are the ones God wants us to hear. Parables, by the way, were not primarily for reading. As we go through this, you can analyze and try and figure out every nuance and every word and every space, but a parable was intended to be heard, not so much picked apart and every word kind of thought over. That's called an allegory. An allegory, every word means something else, and you're supposed to think about it. Ever read Pilgrim's Progress? That's an allegory. Allegories are wonderful if you know what they mean, but the scriptures, and especially parables, are not allegorical. That parable was meant to be heard by a group of people, and right on the spot, they knew what Jesus was talking about. Now, if they didn't accept it, they couldn't understand it, but they knew the story he was telling because he started so clearly, and they went along with him. Well, Jesus used parables to expose the hearts of the hearers. In this first parable is his most important parable, because this is the only parable Jesus completely explains every detail of. And it helps us understand the spiritual implication of this form of teaching.